Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation. I'd very much like to thank you all for joining our webinar today on the patient's understanding of benefit and risk. Now, we've had 260 people register for this webinar, so it would be impossible for us to open up the microphones, but we do have some tools for you to be able to interact with us whilst the webinar is proceeding. So you have the ability to raise your hand, and if you do so, I will be able to see that and then have a private chat with you. And you can also, if you're having audio issues, you have the ability to switch between the microphone settings on your computer similar to Skype and use the telephone. So if you're having dropouts or audio issues, please feel free to use the telephone. We've provided about 12 international toll-free numbers for you to access. So please feel free to switch if you're having problems. And then as well, we will be taking questions through the course of the webinar. So I implore you to keep your questions ready as things happen. We have a log of them, and Alistair and I will endeavor to answer them. So again, I'd like to thank you for your time, and with that, I will now pass over to Alistair Kent, who's the Director of the Genetic Alliance and a member of the Advisory Board of CASME, who will be acting as our moderator and compere. Alistair, I pass to you.
Thank you very much, Dwayne, and welcome everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in. I'm very pleased to be able to chair this webinar. We've got a terrifically experienced panel. Andrea Bayer is from the European Medicines Agency, Jan LeCam from Euroaudit, Pat Furlong from the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy in the US, and Donald Singer from the European Association of Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. Donald is currently having some difficulties logging in, but hopefully by the time it gets to his slot, we will be able to engage with him. This is a very timely topic. The patient input to the issues around striking the benefit-risk balance in novel medicines is currently one that occupies regulatory agencies, companies, patient organizations, and clinicians around the world. How can we articulate the viewpoint of those who are the ultimate end users of innovative medicines and have a say about whether the likely benefits that will come from licensing an innovative therapy will outweigh the risks associated with that, particularly in an environment where the way in which drugs are being developed is changing rapidly. You know, we're going from a traditional model of small molecules and large populations to a situation of stratified medicines, of orphan drugs, where the size of the molecules is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but the number of patients who are likely to benefit from a particular intervention is becoming more and more closely defined, all of which means that the traditional gold standard of the large multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trial is not an appropriate way to decide quality, safety, and efficacy. And the views of patients, of carers, of the end user community about the effectiveness and the desire to take new medicines plays an increasingly important role. But how can we capture those views in a way that reassures the regulators, that gives a consistent message to industry and the academic and clinical communities so that we maintain the flow of new products through the pipeline, and that those millions of patients around the world currently living with unmet medical needs can have a reasonable expectation that as science advances, the regulatory system will allow them to benefit from novel products to target their needs. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jan LeCam from Euroaudit for his input to this seminar. Jan.
Thank you, Alistair, and good morning, everyone. In fact, I will have quickly 5 slides, next please, to drive you through. I think we need to put this question of benefit-risk assessment and involvement of patients into context, and the next two slides you will see are what UORDIS is constantly saying at the moment in terms of advocacy. First, that rare disease treatments is a continuum in terms of evidence generation. There is not a switch on-off at the marketing authorization, and that we need to see that in the broader context of generating evidence during the initial clinical trials and progressively after also the marketing authorization. And that calls for flexibility of the regulators with potentially earlier marketing authorization and adaptive licensing, but also to focus on effectiveness. So in fact, to identify more the right place of a treatment in an overall therapeutic strategy for a given diseases. And also that the dialogue of all stakeholders is essential all along the product development life cycle. Next, please. That translates into some proposals which are relevant to a topic today, such as early dialogue, the involvement of patients' organizational representatives into that early dialogue for scoping and de-risking, but also in the clinical trials and in the dialogue with industry and also in the dialogue with regulators, particularly at the moment of scientific advice and protocol assistance, to discuss the design and the statistical methods and the endpoints, particularly surrogate endpoints, because that are the kind of questions that we will find at the time of marketing authorization assessment. And an important proposal for us is the patient progressive access and adaptive licensing. Next, please. Today, patient representatives are already involved in that exercise. So when we discuss the involvement of patients' representatives into risk-benefit assessment, it's not a revolution, it's simply an evolution. Today, patients are already involved into significant benefit assessment at the time of the marketing authorization application in the Committee of Pharmaceutical Products. They are involved in protocol assistance and scientific advice, so they know how to look at data, how to look at design of clinical trials, at endpoints, and etc. Also, they look at the results of the pediatric investigation plan in the pediatric committee. They look at the assessment of benefit risks of advanced therapies in a specific committee which is for advanced therapies. So they already participate, in fact, to this appreciation of risk-benefit. And also they are involved today into pharmacovigilance assessment and progressively now into HTA when it comes to the assessment of the value, particularly for the European Common Assessment reports. Next, please. I'd like to insist particularly on the accelerated approval, which is being promoted by patient groups both in the US and in Europe, because this accelerated approval, whatever the way it's done by FDA or EMA, means a higher level of uncertainties at the time of the approval. And that calls for higher involvement of patients in risk-benefit assessment. The two elements are completely interconnected. From the patient perspective, the trade-off on risk cannot be the same when it is a new molecule for frequent disease in a large population for which there exist already treatments, or when it comes to a severe disease, either rare or not, for which there is no treatment, so there is an unmet medical need. And as Alistair said, that challenge increase even more with the stratified medicine and personalized medicines. In Europe, at the EMA, it's the patient progressive access, which with adaptive licensing, which is based on conditional marketing approval and post-marketing safety studies, efficacy studies. And this is intended for severe disease with no alternative therapies and for products which have a good safety profile. These are probably the best candidates for that approach. And usually they will be at the end of phase 2 or in a phase 3, but needing a confirmatory study. And that's excellent for us from a patient perspective, because it means that then we will be able, after this conditional approval, to collect data from the targeted population in real life, with all the capturing data from all the heterogeneous expression of the disease across the population. Next, please. And that's my last slide to insist on the tools and methods to make this engagement of patients' representative into the benefit risk assessment real. And for us, it means to have disease-specific patient representatives involved. It's important to have your orders as such, as we are involved already, as we will be involved probably in CHMP, but we are there to guarantee a process and to support the disease-specific patient advocates and facilitate the dialogue with EMA. But the one who knows the disease is the disease-specific patient representative. Two, we are calling for a direct dialogue with the assessors. There is 2 co-rapporteurs on each dossier. It's important to speak with them, not only with CHMP at large. But discussion with CHMP is important because we see from experience that it's important to educate the members of CHMP on the disease itself and on what is a meaningful clinical benefit from the patient perspective. And for that, there is new approaches which are being taken by patient groups to express their preferred treatment options, and that can be written feedback from patient groups, or it can be survey of patients or parents, like the one that has been performed by the network of Duchenne that Pat will refer in a moment. And just to conclude, it's important to keep in mind that down the road, after this decision-making process and scientific evaluation, patient groups will need to communicate about that opinion to the patient and families, about the uncertainties and about the process to reduce these uncertainties and what type of risk we're taking and based on what kind of arguments. But also at the other end, at the beginning, I think everything doesn't come into the involvement and benefit risk assessment time. It's a continuum. We need to have the same patient advocates being involved into early dialogue, into protocol assistance, but also, when possible, to produce guidelines of patients-relevant outcomes, because this is what will be in the discussion at the time of market authorization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Obviously, it's free for any of our listeners to send in questions, and after each presentation, we have one come in that says, how can the collective view of EU patients across many member states be collapsed into a single view to take to the European Medicines Agency? I mean, Jan, do you have a view on that?
Yes, I think that's a good question, but for us it's more or less a question of the past, because we have experienced in the last 10 years that it's not so difficult to consolidate an opinion across the patient advocates for a certain disease across Europe. Because in fact a meaningful health outcome is basically the same in Denmark or in Sicilia. And the appreciation of risk may vary, certainly, because there is a context of your healthcare system and etc. So that there may be variation between the patients in Bulgaria or Romania compared to one in the UK or in Germany. And that's why that kind of surveys are being important. For us, one of the issues will be to make sure that it's not only one patient advocate or 3 patient advocates going to the meetings, but they can base what they're expressing on more data or opinions which are being collected through different methodologies, focus group or quantitative surveys, interviews, whatever, from the patient and families across Europe.
Thanks, Jan. And just before we move on to Pat, from your position as CEO of your audits, I mean, if you had to say in one sentence, what is the unique contribution that patient perspectives can make to the licensing of novel therapies that can come from no other stakeholder in the process? I mean, what would be your primary take-home message for people listening?
At least in the field of rare disease, patients are the one who know best what kind of impact a new treatment will have on their quality of life, on their daily life. So the survival, all that we get from clinical trials, but understanding what's going to be the impact on different elements of their daily life, all that which translates into clinical and also social advantages with these treatments, they are the one who know best. And there is such heterogeneity in the expression of one rare disease across the population of that disease that it's important to involve the patient to appreciate these differences, because the members of CHMP don't have that. And clinical trials hardly capture all of that complexity.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, some people would say, and perhaps Pat might like to comment on this again, that actually patients are, because they are sick, because they are vulnerable, they're actually not able to evaluate properly the benefits of a novel therapy, that this is something which is best left to experts who can take a more objective view. How would you respond to that?
So it's Pat Furlong. Patients live with their diseases. Patients are well equipped to describe the subtle differences that a given compound or therapy intervention might happen to them. So I think in addition to the fact that most of the time when a clinical trial begins to examine a particular intervention, people have lived with their disease for many years. So in the context of a clinical trial, we might not see the full effect of that particular intervention, and it may take some years to really understand the full impact. So I think patients are the best ones to speak about what subtle differences, what effect that has on their quality of life, and certainly the long-term consequences of the intervention.
Brilliant, thanks. Jan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, to make it simple, I fully agree with what Pat said, so no need to repeat. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Well, Jan, we're going to move on now to Pat, so thank you for your input, but we will be back with you for the discussion throughout the course of this webinar. So, you know, don't go away. We'll be back. Pat, over to you now, and thank you for joining us. I know you've had a very early start to make it possible, but we're glad to have you. So your presentation, please.
Thank you. I think my screen should be up by now. So first of all, thank you and good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for including me into the webinar. I think these are incredibly important topics. I have a case study to present to you. We've had, as Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, or PPMD, regular interactions with the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, here in the United States. And one of the discussions we had with them was to share that we felt the benefit-risk equation was far different in rare disease than in more common disorders. The FDA responded and said they did agree with that, but all they had from us and from the community of rare disease was anecdotal stories. So we came back and decided that we would give them a quantitative and qualitative study. And with that, we began to explore to figure out how to understand what the differences are, what the parents or guardians of these children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy felt about benefit-risk. And so we developed a survey that was really developed in concert with parents and patients, getting input from them, really looking at the risk tolerances, the treatment preferences, and the effect on the disease progression to understand the priorities of the Duchenne muscular dystrophy population. So you can see in this list of worries, the worry was my children were missing out on treatments, not being able to get the right care. And then as we looked at from the child-focused, we looked external focus about the parents to see about their own well-being, their deepest worries, and their need for or interest in having time for themselves. We had treatment attributes, so what would they be looking for in a treatment or an intervention? We talked about muscle function because Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a progressive neuromuscular disease in which children lose function over a period of years. So in terms of muscle function, we had questions about stopping the progression of the weakness or slowing it down. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a life-limiting disease as well. Most of the individuals with Duchenne die in their mid to late 20s. So we talked about lifespan. And then we also talked about what they needed to know or wanted to know about the drug in terms of its safety and how far out would they need to have information. You can also look at some of the worries that they might have in terms of side effects. We talked about nausea. We talked about bleeds, and we used the word hemorrhage. We felt that that was a word that maybe some parents would not understand, but we felt that the word hemorrhage carried its own weight in terms of concern, and we talked about arrhythmias. We recruited these patients from Duchenne Connect, which is our patient-reported outcome registry in the United States. It has about 4,000 patients in there currently. The individuals that participated in the survey were parents or guardians of these children. They were greater than 18 years old, and actually the mean age of the parents participating was 45. This study was exempt from an IRB. So these are the preliminary results. 119 parents participated in the survey. The mean age was 43. Their child was 12.1, which means that the child was very involved in his disease, really at the point of perhaps losing ambulation. 80% were biological mothers. You can see that they were all Caucasians, and we certainly recognized and reported to the FDA that these were first responders in our view, patients that were easily accessible and online, and that we would certainly, if with their interest, expand the survey. They had affected children. Most of them had one child. Most of them were well educated. Most of them had in the United States insurance coverage. And 22% or 22 of them, or 19, had experience with this child a life-threatening situation. We've now isolated that group out to understand if their preferences were different. So these are the preliminary results. The most concern is my child is getting weaker, and that these parents wanted to find that they, or believe that they had achieved optimal care for their child. You can see on the bottom that the least important thing for these parents and guardians were having time for themselves. So these are the preliminary conclusions. These parents prioritized slowing or stopping this disease above all other things, and they were willing to risk a longer lifespan. They would trade off that longer lifespan to have a slowly progressing disease. Their most significant worries were related to progression and care. And this population is concerned about the effect of Duchenne on their child's strength, and certainly willing to accept risk in the face of uncertainty for the opportunity to slow or halt muscle disease. These are our collaborators, and I will stop there and ask for questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Pat. That was a fascinating presentation. We've had a number of questions coming in, and we'll go to those in just a moment. But I'm interested in the remark you made about why you think rare diseases and common diseases are different. I mean, why do you think there is a difference between a family coping with a rare disease like Duchenne as compared with a more common childhood condition?
Thanks, Alistair. I think it's different because in rare disease, often these are progressive, debilitating, and certainly life-limiting diseases. So the day of diagnosis, you hear all of these words, progressive, life-limiting. You hear about all of the prognosis that is likely to face you. And so I think that there is a second diagnosis of parents with chronic illness. I sort of compare it to being on a carousel where you're on a horse that's going between hope and despair every single day, and that you are looking at an inner circle of dark horses, if you will, that are all of the worries and all of the prognosis that you've been given. So I think that recognizing that you have a disease with a known progression, or relatively known progression, you are every day making these trade-offs about if my child could only walk longer, if my child could live longer, if my child could move their arms longer, breathe longer, if their heart would work. So I think you're consistently making these trade-offs. So I think that you begin to really focus in on what the benefit is you're looking for and what the risk you're willing to accept. And so therefore, and I think our pilot demonstrated that these parents faced with the prognosis of a disease are facing an uncertainty every day. And in the U.S. slang, we would say we're waiting for the shoe to drop nearly every day, and in that you make choices. And so I think the benefit-risk is far different in a progressive, debilitating, rare disease than it would be in a common disease.
Right, and a question from one of our listeners about do you feel that the work you have done in this area has actually changed the view of the regulators, of the FDA, about the importance of receiving evidence from which is derived from patients? And Jan, I'll come to you in a minute to ask your opinion on that as well in the European context.
I think with regard to the United States and the FDA, as perhaps you're aware, we have FDASIA, which really requires the FDA to listen to the patient voice. I think social network has enabled and encouraged the patient voice, and I think the FDA and the EMA are listening to that voice. And I do believe listening to that voice, they're becoming more informed about the unmet need and more willing to be flexible in their review process.
Yeah. When you say, I mean, you can listen to the patient voice, but do you think they're actually responding, they're changing as a result of that listening? Are we gaining traction here with the regulators to make them change the way they do things, do you think?
So I only have my N=1 experience in the United States. We've had frequent interactions with the FDA, and the FDA has agreed, and we are now just completing the first draft guidance in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. This is written by our community. I feel like the FDA is becoming, and the EMA are becoming very good partners, willing to understand. I think on the other hand, they are looking for pilots in benefit risk. They are looking for some confidence in terms of their willingness to be flexible in review and willingness to listen to the patient stories and trying to put that into a qualitative and quantitative context so that they can rely on it.
Right. And Jan, what about you? I mean, again, the European Medicines Agency has a requirement to listen, but do you feel that they are, again, changing as a result of their listening?
I think so very strongly. If we look at the facts, it's not, first the quantitative one, if not qualitative, is that when we started the involvement of patient representative in the EMA, it was in the 90s for the HIV, and then it's only in 2000 that there were patient representatives in committees, and you were one of them and me too, and we were only 3 of us in that position. Last year there were over 500 patient representatives who participated one way or another in the work of the EMA, in the different scientific committees, in scientific advice, in reviewing public documents. Now when we look at the qualitative impact, just to take 3 quick examples, protocol assistance, the EMA has made an evaluation of the contribution of patient representative in scientific advice protocol assistance, and it shows that in more than 50% of the cases, the contribution made by the patient representatives at the meeting have been strong or significant on the scientific opinion given to the sponsor, so it's very significant. When I look also at the Committee of Orphan Medicinal Product, when we discuss significant benefit, either at the time of designation on the potential of a drug, or when we assess the data at the time of marketing authorization, when it comes to the appreciation of, for instance, the major contribution to patient care, what does that mean in terms of a benefit for patients? Then the patient say is very strong in the Committee of Orphan Medicinal Products. And more recently, if I look at the CHMP itself, so the licensing committee, when it's about risk-benefit assessment, we've just experienced in the field of Duchenne the fact that patients, the Duchenne patient networks with Parent Project and the neuromuscular associations together with UORDES, writing to the European Medicine Agency and saying, please consider conditional approval for that medicines based on the following arguments, etc. Then the EMA is listening, is asking questions, is involving the patient's representative, and that seems to have had some sort of impact on the opinion of the CHMP at the end. So my answer is yes.
Yeah. One final question for you, Jan, before we move on to hear from Andrea. In your presentation, you mentioned the importance of involving patients who actually have the condition for which the medicine for which a marketing authorization is being sought. How do you think that will work in practice, given that we're in some cases dealing with incredibly rare conditions and patients and families scattered across the whole of Europe?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I'm not sure we have the full answer to that. 3 points. One is that for sure what we're saying to EMA is that it's not sufficient to involve European umbrella organization on rare disease such as UORDES. That's not sufficient. We need in the room, when it comes to appreciation of the trade-off between risk and benefit. You need the people who know really their disease. And you don't need one. You need several of them. That's really the first thing. Because even if they are not able to bring additional data from any sort of surveys like Pat just showed, at least you need to have patient representatives from different countries in Europe for that disease, which are already well articulated. Then how to identify them? We have the experience already since 15 years now in working with EMA in identifying patient representatives for protocol assistance or for other procedures like pharmacovigilance sometime. So we know how to do that, at least in the network of rare disease patients organizations. We can have access to a lot of them who have been trained through e-learning or through face-to-face trainings on clinical trials and regulatory affairs. So there is people already articulated who are able to come into the room and make their contribution in a significant way using the same concept and terminology.
Thanks, Jan. And Pat, I mean, you know, similar problems must exist in the US of involving patients who don't live within kind of 15 miles of the FDA's building. I mean, how do you ensure that kind of inclusivity for your members and for others with different conditions?
So I think there are a number of ways, and basically they all involve meeting with the regulatory agencies. One of the ways that the European parents have done quite well is to videotape some of the young adults with Duchenne and ask them very specifically of what is important to you. That video was presented to the EMA about a year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years, in a meeting. We did a very similar thing by having a policy forum in the United States with the FDA and asking patients and their parents to speak about what's important and their description of the unmet need in terms of how they live their life in the context of this disease. So I think there are a variety of ways, and in my view, the videotape of patients that describe really face-to-face what is important to them and what they would like to see in terms of change with a given intervention is quite striking to the FDA, along with studies such as we've done to provide some confidence that this is representative of the population they're studying.
Brilliant, yeah. Perhaps when we come to the general discussion at the end of this time, we can think about the potential of some of the social media, the Facebook, the Twitter, and so on, to contribute in novel ways to this discussion. But
absolutely.
I'm anxious to give our two final speakers a fair crack of the whip. And Andrea, you're up next. Andrea Bayer is from the European Medicines Agency and the University of Groningen. So, Andrea, are you ready to go?
Yes. Good morning. Good morning, Alistair. Thank you for the introduction. I see that my slides are just now loaded. I spent 4.5 years at the EMA working as a national expert on secondment from the University of Groningen, and the slides I will show today pertain to studies. One study that we launched in collaboration with the EMA to address some of the issues that the previous speakers have raised, how to measure patients' understanding of benefits and risk, and how to communicate that information in a way that may be useful for the regulators. So if we could go to the first, please. So there is there has been discussion from the executive director of the EMA. The next slide, please. Right. So there has been a discussion within the EMA, and particularly in a presentation made by Guido Rossi sometime last year, in February of last year, which shows you the interest of the agency in focusing on bringing the patient's perspective into the decision-making process. This entire discussion is supported by an ongoing interest and project over the last few years within the EMA on how to make the benefit-risk decision-making more transparent within the agency and how to communicate that information to the public. In order to focus specifically on the patient's views, patient preferences, their perspective, we designed a study using decision analytic theory and methods that have been in existence for several decades, I would say over 5 decades, to measure preferences for specific outcomes within a group of multiple sclerosis patients. This model that we use, there are several, but we believe that this is the most suitable model for this population and for this discussion. This model allows for the qualitative collection of data from patients who may have low numeracy and therefore wouldn't be able to or would struggle to give very quantitative information, which is also another way of collecting this type of data. We use a model that collects qualitative data. We were able to program a user interface that is very much resembles a very simple, straightforward survey, but behind the user interface it is supported by a very sophisticated algorithm that can translate the responses given by the patients into quantitative data. We can deploy this in many sites. It can be accessed via the web. Therefore, you can see the utility of using it among a group of patients that are located in several sites in their homes. And the data that we are able to collect can then be used to build a treatment decision model, meaning that you can use this data to actually evaluate, do I take treatment A or treatment B? This can be done from the patient's perspective, it can be done from the regulator's perspective, and the results compared. Next slide, please. What I'd like to show you in this next slide is the actual steps that we use in order to build the model. So for the MS study, we determined that there were several efficacy and safety outcomes, treatment outcomes, all relevant or mostly all relevant to many of the MS treatments that are currently on the market. For brevity, we chose 6, but this can be expanded or it can be reduced depending on the actual question that needs to be discussed and the data that needs to be collected. For MS, 3 efficacy treatment outcomes that are very important and are usually reported are number of relapses, time to disease progression, and the disability due to disease progression. The adverse events or the risks could vary between liver failure for some treatments, PML was notable for Tysabral, and leukemia for another product that is currently on the market. So we are able to build this type of model, changing the actual outcomes we would like to focus on depending on the question. And from this, we are able to collect information. If you go to the next slide, please. We are able to collect information, asking patients about a specific treatment outcome and how they value that outcome and how they would weight that outcome. So the first set of questions would focus on different levels between each outcome. For relapses, we ask patients about having no relapses compared to 1 relapse compared to 2 relapses. But the way they provide us the information is using a cardinal scale, which is a Likert-like scale, very easy to for them to understand and to give us the responses. And then we are able in the background to translate this to an actual qualitative score. Next slide, please. Once we've collected the value information, because we do it in 2 steps, first values and then weights, we then use a particular method, again grounded in decision theory principle, to collect the weights, which have the patients identify what of all the outcomes that we have shown them, which outcome would be the most important outcome if they could improve only one, and then how important is that improvement for them. From this information, we are able to determine how much weight they place on the particular outcome. So again, two pieces of information, the value scores that we elicit earlier on, and then the weight. If you go to the next slide, please, I'll show you exactly how the information, well, brief description of how the information is then used to build a model. Once we've collected both the values and the weights, we are then using the actual performance of a hypothetical, for this purpose, treatment A and treatment B. How these treatments actually performed based on what was the number of relapses experienced under treatment A, or what was the number of relapses experienced under treatment B. And using the data collected from patients, we are then able to give a total score. Again, the qualitative information is turned into quantitative information. We are able to give a treatment score for treatment A versus treatment B and to see which treatment gains a higher score from that patient's perspective. We would do this and have done it over a number of patients. So in this pilot study we did, it had 62 patients. And we have launched a new study across Europe just 2 months ago to collect data from over 2,600 patients and 2,600 healthcare professionals to similarly assess the utility, feasibility of building these types of models where you're collecting qualitative information, transforming them to quantitative scores to be able to determine what treatment would be preferred, but not only what treatments would be preferred, what are the individual treatment outcomes and where do people, either healthcare professionals or regulators or patients, place the most weight. If you move to the next slide, please. These
here, Andrea.
Yes, Alistair.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. These steps are fairly straightforward. Patients found them easy to understand, and we were able to do additional analysis that showed that there were subgroups within the patient population that could distinguish between different values and different scores and different weights. And so it's a very robust methodology, and I believe the EMA is supporting additional work in this area to evaluate using this methodology to assess how to bring patients' preferences and views into the discussions within the various committees.
Thanks. Thanks. Good. Is that it?
Yes, that's it.
Brilliant, thank you. One question came in while you were talking. Did you feed back the results of your study to the participants, and did they agree with the, did what you think you found relate to their perception of life with the condition? Did it actually measure those things which patients thought to be important?
That's a two-part question. In the beginning, we advocate now to when you're designing such a model, to have patients or patient focus groups actually help you determine what were the most important treatment outcomes to measure. We did not do so for this particular study, but we have done so for the other study that we recently launched. We have communicated the
I was going to say, so you're reasonably confident that what you're measuring ties in with what actually relates to the patient experience?
Yes, we are. We have communicated this in several committee meetings, several organization committee meetings, but people tend mostly to focus on the methodology. The outcomes we measured are very reflective of efficacy and safety outcomes.
Good, great. I want to bring in Donald Singer here, our fourth panelist, because Donald, you raised a point about surrogate endpoints, and rather than trying to paraphrase your comment, would you like to raise it yourself?
Yes, so the context here was the European Medicines Agency has been very keen to engage in the same room with patients industry and healthcare professionals, and healthcare professionals panel through the European Association of Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. But the recent discussion there has been about the wish to have obvious clinical outcomes that matter to patients long term and to prescribers and professionals. However, a strong recognition by EMA that for the newer agents and for higher risk syndromes and rare syndromes, that's not practical in the early stages, and very much a signal welcoming both as a message to patients and to industry that good surrogate endpoints certainly would help to move along in terms of both evidence, early use, but also helping the funding side for the biotech industry interested in supporting this.
Right, thank you. Andrea, do you want to respond quickly to that before we go back to Donald for his presentation?
No, I think Donald encapsulated the point quite well.
Brilliant, thank you, thank you. I'm conscious of time, and I want to give Donald a fair crack at the whip. So, Donald, now if we can move to your presentation and hear what you have to say.
Fine, sure, just quick thing. So is the screen share option switched on there?
Yes, it is. We've got your...
Got your slides, Donald.
Good, thank you. Excellent. In brief, I think it's worth putting this in context. So I'm a health professional, both personally in therapeutics, but also interested in the EACPD perspective. That's a good way to consider Europe as a whole. We have 32 countries who we support through education and training, and that's a good way to engage with professionals and patients in terms of some of the key issues. I think some of the points of note have to be clearly which health system we're talking about, whether it's a very public system like the UK, mixed models, not-for-profit Europe, or more dominant private in some other systems. That makes a big difference in terms of what becomes affordable and what questions are being asked. But certainly a big question for health professionals is what patients are worried about, and what matters to them is both what the evidence is for any test, will it influence their insurance profile, will it deprive them of potential treatment they might otherwise get. They might prefer a 5% benefit of something they get rather than 100% of something they don't get. And they hate uncertainty, patients, and so having a clear framework for getting the message right, both in the profession but also in the media, is very important. The skepticism, if we consider, we move on to my third slide, the skepticism regarding practitioners in terms of, next slide please, regarding what we have out there in terms of questions. But we clearly have, in terms of old-fashioned but major problems, hypertension and wasted profile. We've major current controversy in statins, for example, statins in the UK. What does that mean in terms of understanding risk on both sides? We have cancer, which has come up repeatedly, the concept of how you use companion therapeutics. And then we have increasingly in the resource-poor world, but new technologies which may help in terms of understanding some of the key questions in terms of what drugs to use, but how to use new biomarkers well in an affordable way. So next slide, please. However, this is the big challenge. We have in, here's a quote from the FDA, patients really don't know a lot about medicines, and they either may believe a lot about what goes on and trust, or alternatively, adherence may be very low, as poor as 50% in many common diseases if we don't get patients well informed. Next slide, please. I think as a professional, huge challenges include who gives the message, and many of our physicians are not well trained both in the in terms of patients, but also how you explain risk. Short time we have, in general, we're not very good at making sure patients understand what we've said or backing up with written messages or or good online tools. Next slide, please. The other challenge we have, of course, is that the media is very keen to have strong stories. People don't like to have very bland messages, and so they tend either deliberately or by omission to muddle up absolute and relative risk. So it's really important that we understand that media headlines can be very difficult when it comes to patients being uncertain of what's going on. So my next slide illustrates this very briefly. If you look at the bottom of the slide, when it comes to education, recent surveys have shown that patients don't really understand whether 3 out of 10 or 5 out of 100 is bigger, often will plump for the 5 over 100, thinking the top line is what matters. So when we think we're explaining very simple concepts, we have to be aware that numeracy really is very poor in terms of many even of our better educated patients. Just to draw to a close, the next slide summarizes what the EMA has been trying to do in its recent PROTECT consortium. And this shows a structure about getting things right about principles, how to explain clearly risks and benefits, and how to show this. But this has identified already 47 frameworks, very confusing. The next slide shows you what would be the ideal physicians or other prescribers' view of how you could explain to patients. A very simple line on the left, harm more than benefit for treatment, on the right, benefit better than harm, and you can model in cost in here. But in reality, we're usually talking about more than one issue in terms of either benefit and cost. Next slide. So a very good way to consider how this might be done is shown in the next slide, which shows you a tornado display in the red adverse effects, but also the size of the plot gives you the weighting. And you can see in the left, this is for diabetes, and this is a way to model in this case, HbA1c, which is a surrogate. You might also include here cardiovascular events and death, and apply this to wide range of disorders. Next slide. On my next slide, just to conclude, I think what we have is not just health professionals and patients, but to consider the funders and the funding model and how that's made clear, that the reality that it may well be the costs may go down in terms of tests, but if fewer drugs are sold, that's going to cost a lot more. And how on earth you model in that in terms of more expensive drugs as the lifestyle goes on? Consider much more broadly educators in the media and beyond, and ethics when you consider the relationships. And use our major agencies such as EMA and NICE, FDA and PMDA in terms of getting good dialogue across patients and professionals, and good instruments like the tornado plot, which can make life easier in terms of explaining the message. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Donald. Interested in the graph that you showed in one of your slides, where the horizontal line was the harm line. I wonder if you think that is an absolute line, that it doesn't shift between conditions, or do patients with different conditions, are they prepared to tolerate different levels of possible harm, do you think, from your research?
So I think you've really hit on the problem with the simplicity of the diagram. I think a professional would love that kind of diagram. In fact, it's not correct. Either both the perception of risk. If somebody with a lethal condition with only one drug to choose, even though it's not very effective, is more likely to accept that. If there are many possible choices, that makes a difference. And as you saw, the severity of the disease, that the harm risk benefit may well change, and people's perception of what they're prepared to accept may change. So I think that's why there are these 47 different tools, and it becomes complexity. Another obvious thing is if it comes to, say, litigation, one line may be masking the fact that the confidence intervals may be quite broad in terms of who's deprived of treatment or who's offered treatment that has an unfortunate complication. So that side of things is also very complicated.
Yeah. And I'd like also the views about some of our other panelists who might want to hear. But when talking about the limited understanding that many patients have about the magnitude of effects and their understanding of the risks they face, do you think that is in any way different in patients with rare diseases as compared to common diseases? In other words, are patients with a rare disease more likely to be interested in that kind of nitty-gritty detail about their treatment than patients with a common condition? Donald, lead off, and then maybe Pat.
I think you're right. With rare diseases, the patients and their families and carers tend to be much better informed, but they may also be much more anxious about the complications and risks. And for example, if you say take heart transplantation as a not very common procedure with higher risk and a lot of complexity, then it's people who are very well informed, in fact, who have most difficulty with many of the procedures and the treatments involved. And so it's not as simple as being informed. It's being informed and having confidence in your physician, confidence in the evidence for what's happening. So it's a complex story getting it right. I think what the advertising industry does, they have a continuous story about their products, and I think what we need to do as health professionals and industries, make sure that the message is varied and repeated, and we're checking repeatedly with our patient groups as to what they find clear and not clear, what they're uncertain about in the story.
Thanks. Jan or Pat, do you want to come in there, or Andrea? Do you think rare disease patients are better engaged,
yes.
better informed?
Yes. Yes, obviously yes. If you the level of risk that a patient is ready to take as a risk is not the same. For instance, when you are a woman, a pregnant woman who wants to take a drug for headache is not ready to have a child with malformation, like with the thalidomide story in the 60s. And today, when you take a drug to lose weight, you're not ready to expose yourself to heart failure or to suicide. So obviously, you're not ready to take that type of risk because the kind of health issue you're trying to address is not life-threatening, and also there is plenty of therapeutic options. So you want to take your lower risk option for an effective treatment. When you have a rare disease, but that would be broader than rare disease, I would say when you have a disease which is severe, debilitating, and life-threatening, which is the case of most rare disease, not all of them. Sometimes you have treatment options which are simple, and the rare disease is not threatening your life in some cases, so you don't want to take maximum risk. But when you are in a progressive disease, life-threatening, yes, you're ready to take more risks, and you want to know and I think the patients are really able to formulate the level of risk they want to take, even if they don't understand the statistics. They know what makes a meaningful difference in their quality of life.
Pat, would you agree with that, or do you have a different perspective?
Yes, I certainly agree with Jan, and I think we have to realize that the patients with a rare disease are already carrying risk and uncertainty, and it is they have it because they have the disease, so that they know the progression of the disease, they know that this is life-threatening in many cases, so they have already accepted risk. And I think if we look at Duchenne muscular dystrophy as a model, these patients are the only intervention that is generally recommended are corticosteroids. And those patients accept corticosteroids with the known risks of the negative impact on growth, on puberty, on the possibility of diabetes, or certainly insulin resistance based on the steroids. So I think these people live with an inherent risk and disease. So I think we have to understand that as the starting point, and then talk about the interventions and what potential benefit they confer, and at what cost, or what risk.
Thanks. There's a couple of, I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but there's a couple of very important questions come in from the audience, which I want to get in before we close. So if I can ask you to be brief in your responses to these. But one of these is about the risk of litigation if you allow drugs onto the market for patient use that could be deemed to be more risky or insufficiently tested by conventional standards. I mean, do you think there is any, do any of the panel members think there is any way in which we can mitigate the risk of litigation and so give regulators the confidence they need to allow these innovative medicines through to patients?
If I could pick up on that,
yeah.
Don Singer here. Just to comment, I think one of the issues, of course, is how rapidly you discover the important interactions and serious risks early on that could help. And I think that there are some very good new platforms which allow you to do so-called network pharmacology to work out some unexpected effects of these new agents at an earlier stage. And that would help in terms of at least looking out for these potential risks. But I think there has to be a strong dialogue with insurance industry and clear information to say that this drug is not as fully tested as elsewhere. How that works legally, I think, is going to be different in different jurisdictions.
Yeah, Andrea, as a kind of EMA insider, I mean, what would give colleagues within the EMA confidence to accept mitigate the risk of possible litigation, do you think?
It's a bit difficult to answer that question, and I would say it's outside the scope. But I think what is really important for the regulators, from the perspective that I have, is the data. They need to have information regarding what we're discussing today, what patients prefer, where they place their weight, what benefits, what trade-offs they're willing to take, and what trade-offs they're not willing to take. Once they understand the risk attitude and the risk tolerance of the population, then I think that by itself limits the prospect of litigation, because we are dealing exactly, or they will be dealing exactly with what patients are telling them that they're willing to deal with and risks that they're willing to undertake.
Great, yes, and I think the corollary of that is transparency of the process, so that people can see how decisions have been reached and how things have been weighted. One final question. We're running out of time very rapidly, but somebody raised the point, isn't there a concern that the squeaky wheel gets the oil, and the patient group that shouts loudest will receive a disproportionate share of the attention? And is that a rational basis for making decisions about innovative medicines? I mean, very quickly, going through the panelists, what do you think of that, Pat?
So I think patients are afforded a significant amount of tools, to include social networking, to raise their voice. I'm not sure the squeakiest wheel will get the decision, but I think the squeakiest wheel enables others to become squeaky wheels, if you will, and gives others the confidence to raise their voice. So I think we'll never know which particular tactic was sufficiently helpful to have the regulators make a decision. That said, I think to validate the opinions of all patients is quite important, and the use of social networking and other tools is going to be an important concept as we go forward.
Brilliant. Yeah. Thanks very much. Jan?
I'm not sure that the bigger groups will get higher influence. I think what is needed is to know really what they are talking about, and that can be for very smaller group who are more in-depth, rather than using communication tool which might even turn against those patient groups. So I'm not sure that this has to do with the current influence, neither at the time of benefit risk, neither at the time of reimbursements, in fact, when I look at the cases. And if I may just go back to your previous question, I think we also need to think not only at the time of benefit risk assessment, but the way to mitigate this appreciation of risk from the regulator's point of view and authorities is also on the post-marketing studies on safety and efficacy and on effectiveness, which can be put in place, and how the information is monitored, so that if a risk higher than expected is appearing, then a decision can be made early on. The system can be reactive. And I think that's important. It's not so, for me, the issue of appreciation of risk and how much risk you're ready to take is about what you know at the moment of your assessment, but also what kind of process you're putting in place to collect additional evidence and how you will monitor that in a reactive way.
Thanks. Andrea, are you resistant to squeaky wheels?
I think I go along with Pat and Jan. It's not necessarily about who shouts the loudest. I think particularly the EMA and certainly at the FDA, they've shown that they are listening and trying to listen to everyone, and trying to explore methodology that would be universal and can be used and accessible by everyone, that helps the communication. So I think people need the organizations need to be educated about what these agencies, these organizations are actually doing in order to get their voice there, and not think that they do not have the possibility to voice their concerns, their needs equally with either louder or bigger organizations. I think the door is open, and the regulators are listening.
Yeah, Donald, a final brief word from you on this before we close.
Yes, I think it's a very important question. I think behind that you might say is how on earth do you lever out investment, interest, and clinical application of treatments for rare diseases with no current major therapeutic outlet. And I think it's partly down to serendipity, partly opportunity, and partly funding. And for example, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the States has shown that very much their voice was very effective because they had the money, they drove interest and led to very successful innovation in biologicals for treating that condition. So I think if there's funding and a rational therapeutic strategy that could be developed, I think that could make a difference. But I think we have a huge question of how we look at the overall cost and of doing the work, but also the cost of treatment at the end to make sure that this all becomes affordable and that the voices can be heard. And I think what Europe does is right, EMA involving all the patient groups, and NICE likewise is really important in the absence of those groups having the kind of funding that Cystic Fibrosis Foundation managed to secure.
Thank you. Well, we've run out of time, I'm afraid. I'd like to thank our four panelists for some very stimulating conversation. I'd also like to thank our listeners out there for sending in loads of questions, which unfortunately we haven't had a chance to address in the time available. But I hope everybody has felt that this has been an informative and an engaging conversation that we've had over the past hour. I think the work that's been done through by Dwayne and his colleagues at Vital Transformation in making it possible to have this conversation is very helpful in moving the debate forward when considering the idea of the patient's understanding of benefit and risk. So in saying thank you to our participants, thank you to our listeners and to Vital Transformations, I hope you will take the messages away from this and be able to apply them in the situations in which you find yourself. So thank you all, and good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending on where you are in the world.